Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Breaking Brews podcast, a podcast focused on the business side of beer and what's driving today's thriving craft beer industry. Whether you're one of the thousands of people making craft beer what it is today, or just love great beer and want to know more about it, this show is here to cover everything from sales, marketing, branding, culture, and much, much more. The Breaking Brews podcast delivers real-life scenarios and experiences from industry professionals that will help your beer knowledge evolve. To tap into more great beer content, visit breakingbrews.com today. And now, the moment you've been waiting for. Let's get this session started. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the Breaking Brews podcast. I am your host, Jason Sircone. If you haven't done so already, guess what? There are 20 live sessions of the Breaking Brews podcast waiting just for you in the archives. Jump back, listen to what we've done prior to this show. You can subscribe to the Breaking Brews podcast on Stitcher, on iTunes, on Google Play, and Spotify, and you can stay up to date on everything about the show on breakingbrews.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, jump over to iTunes, drop a rating, drop a review. Let me know how I'm doing with the Breaking Brews podcast. Feedback is always welcome, and you will help the show find the ears of more thirsty beer enthusiasts and craft beer professionals just like you. All right, we are jumping into session 21, and I am welcoming back to the podcast Zach Morrow, who is the co-founder and head brewer at Noblestein Brewing Company in Indiana, Pennsylvania. Zach joined me as we got the Breaking Brews podcast off the ground with session 1, where we talked about some of the do's and some of the don'ts that you should know if you're looking to open a brewery. If you haven't done so, jump back in the archives and you can learn more about Zach and his plight with Noblestein Brewing Company. Today we are talking about jumping from homebrewing to pro-brewing, and Zach's going to share his story about going from homebrewing in his college dorm room or college apartment up to the commercial system that he currently brews on as we speak at Noblestein Brewing Company. So for all of you folks out there that are listening to this podcast that have been thinking about doing some home brewing, Zach's going to share what it takes to get started in that capacity. If you are a home brewer as you listen to this show and you've been wondering if it is time to make that leap into home brewing, Zach is going to talk about some of the things that you should know before you take that jump. So lots of great things to talk about on the Breaking Brews podcast today. I'm going to let you guys dive right in. This is session 21 of the Breaking Brews podcast with Zach Morrow of Noblestein Brewing Company once again joining the podcast. All right, we are live once again with the Breaking Brews podcast. I am your host, Jason Sircone, and I am once again joined by Mr. Zach Morrow, the head brewer and owner of Noblestein Brewing in Indiana, Pennsylvania. Zach, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Hello. Good to be here.
So today we're going to pick Zach's brain about jumping from home brewing to the professional brewing level. This is something Zach did. He got his start as a home brewer and was able to transition over to being a professional brewer.
Indeed.
Did you get the official certification that says you are a professional brewer? The T-shirt, the certificate, medal?
I actually got the brewing boots. It's that's the new thing, I think.
They send you boots?
It's not a T-shirt anymore. It's a pair of boots, yeah.
Well, it's practical.
Indeed.
Very good. So if you want to know more about Zach, he actually sat down with me for episode 1 of the Breaking Brews podcast, and you can jump back in the archives and hear all about his trek before becoming a brewer and everything that these guys have been doing to build the Noblestein Brewing brand over the past couple years. So like many brewers, Zach, you got your start home brewing, as we said before, so let's talk about how you got into beer in the first place, and I'm talking about even before you started home brewing, what really got your juices flowing about good beer, and what led to you picking up the hobby of home brewing?
Yeah, I was a student at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, better known as IUP. I usually party. The whole list goes on. And admittedly, maybe or maybe not before I was 21, my friends and I, we would end up getting beers, and we quickly tired the cheap stuff. We quickly tired of natty ice, and I think for good reason. It's not really appealing. So we would try to save a little bit and get a little bit less, but of higher quality. So instead of the natties and all of the counterparts, we would save up and we'd get a 4-pack or a 6-pack at the time of Heineken, or we would get some other import. And then we started moving into more of the domestic craft stuff. So I would like to think that during college we tried a fair amount of different beers, at least what was available here. So this is 10 or 11 years ago. It wasn't the market that it is today.
Yeah. College kids today have it so good.
Well,
at least if they want, like I went to college with a bunch of guys that totally dug Natty Light the whole way through school.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. I mean, to think that so many college towns now have a brewery, steps away from campus or nearby. It certainly gives folks the ability to try things earlier, try stuff that's fresh and well made. So, with us and of course Levity in Indiana, the IUP campus is very close to both of us. So, the students that stop in, it's really cool to help them start their craft beer journey in a sense.
All right, so after college, you had acquired a great taste for craft beer, and homebrewing was the next step. So how did that come to be?
Yeah, actually, my wife bought me a brewing kit for my 21st birthday. So this was as we were living on campus, and she bought me, I believe it was, I forgot the brand name, but it was the 2-bucket setup, the classic.
Nice.
And it came with one beer kit as well. It was an extract kit, and specifically it was a Canadian ale kit. So I got this for my birthday, and I think once the winter semester started back up, I called a number of my friends and said, hey, you want to try to brew some beer? So probably 5 or 6 of us gathered into this tiny apartment, and we filled the place with the smell of hops and potentially caramelizing malt extract on the stove. But that being said, it was a blast. We had a great time. It was a good excuse to get together, drink beers, make a beer, and to be totally honest with you, I had really no expectations of it. I didn't know. This is my first venture in, and everybody that was there, it was also their first try. So we all just kind of dove in head first and hoped for the best.
So what style of beer did you guys do right off the bat? Was that first beer?
The kit was called Canadian Ale. It was basically just a blonde ale.
Okay.
It was probably, in retrospect, a pretty good kit to start on. It was simple and easy to brew, and there weren't a lot of extraneous steps that would be picked up in beers that would involve dry hopping or spice adds or anything like that.
That's something I'd like to bring up in regards to homebrewing. Is that something that, like the dry hopping and all of these steps that I hear a lot of breweries doing with IPAs, especially today, is that something that's practiced often in the homebrewing world?
Absolutely. And I think what I'll say on that is become more regular with the marketplace. So I think it could be thought of as a chicken or egg question in a sense. Was it the homebrewers that started making more beers like this? I would say it's probably more likely the commercial breweries that help to proliferate it better, simply based on the logic of distribution channels.
Right.
But with that said, there were plenty of beers that we made on the homebrew scale that we did in fact dry hop. Now, the actual carrying out of that task might be the same. It might be different, just depending on your equipment.
So your Canadian ale, how'd that turn out?
Surprisingly, it was pretty good. I still remember the day that we all sat around. So a handful of the guys that brewed it with me, we were all together one night. What was it? 2 weeks plus 4 weeks later after bottle conditioning, something like that. And we decided, hey, it's time to actually try it. So I remember as a novice and as my personality kind of leads to, I was extremely uncomfortable and paranoid about whether I'd waited long enough. So, bottle conditioned, carbonated in the bottle, and I was waiting till the exact day to even bother to crack one. So I waited till that exact day, nearly down to the hour, I think, because I'm that bad. And we all cracked one together, and we were shocked. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was a great beer, but it was definitely a drinkable beer.
Yeah.
And we ended up drinking a number of them that evening. So it was a great, really a great first step, because I felt like after that experience, it definitely helped to uphold my interest. You know, if something had gone wrong, there's always the possibility that I would have been discouraged or lost interest or just stuck with drinking beers in the marketplace, you know. So.
It seems like something very similar to cooking. That your first time in the kitchen, you're just not going to do that great. Or maybe you will have some beginner's luck and your whatever you cook will come out edible, but typically you're not blowing the world apart with your very first crack at it. But I still think, not being a home brewer myself, I'd have to think this is one of those things where you can't get discouraged with your first go at it, because the likelihood of it being this super ridiculously great beer is pretty low.
Sure. Yeah, and even still, you know, you're right. The analogy to cooking, I use that occasionally when I'm explaining the recipe design process to folks. I will say that on the brew side, and I mentioned that the beer that we made first was relatively simple to brew. You know, that was the case, again, compared to other kits even, and of course compared to all grain. But with that being said, all of the other processes involved, like all of your sanitizing processes and kind of your mise en place, keeping everything organized, those things are indispensable with regard to the efficiency of your process. So the other thing that was admittedly a little bit discouraging the first time through was just the length of time that it took.
Yeah.
You know, it seemed like it was this really long process. So again, you know, I could see people very quickly getting discouraged with homebrewing, and any homebrewer that crosses the threshold of Nobelstein, once we talk, you know, if something hasn't worked out just as they had planned, I really make it a point to encourage them to keep going with it. I think it's really, really important to take multiple whacks at this thing.
So what came next after the Canadian Ale? What did you start doing things on your own, or did you and your friends stay together? And I mean, I think, and knowing you guys, this was the original group that ended up making up Nobelstein as you opened, correct?
Some of it, yeah.
Okay.
There were some overlap there, but not completely. There were a few friends that were friends from college that ended up moving elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But in the grand scheme of things, this was, ironically, it was pretty close to when we were finishing up school. So we didn't do any other beers together on campus there. But my next beer, it was a Belgian wit, and I don't remember the specifics of it, but I think it was a normal ABV range with some spice adds to it.
Did you upgrade equipment as you continued down this path?
The first few I did not. I just used the same buckets and had stuck with bottling. I was a little afraid of the proposition of kegging beer at that point, but over time I would recognize just how much of a headache saver that is compared to bottling. But now, even hearkening back to the wit that I made, I actually was thankful to have that be my second experience. I decided to get a little bit cute with that one and add some honey to the secondary, all the while not really considering the fermentable nature of it. So I had bottled it off, very excited to try it out, liked the style, liked the fact that I tweaked the kit a little bit. And, you know, a week or so goes by as the beer is sitting comfortably in my closet. And at about 2 or 3 in the morning one night, I'm fast asleep and I hear glass breaking. And I thought someone was legitimately breaking into my apartment right beside my bed. So I woke up and windows intact. So opened the closet door, and somehow several of these bottles had blown up. Not only was there beer all over my clothes, but in some miracle, one bottle had blown up and legitimately landed back in the box in its slot on the cap. So it flipped up in the air, upside down. I still don't know how that happened, but needless to say, I had to wash all my stuff so I didn't go to work smelling as though I'd had quite a bender the night before.
I have to believe there's so many stories just like that.
Oh, for sure.
Homebrewers across the country, and professional brewers too.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
Yep, definitely.
That shit starts to take shape. You just don't know sometimes you just don't know what's coming.
Absolutely.
So what are some tips and pointers that you can give to aspiring homebrewers that might be listening to the Breaking Brews podcast today?
Well, I think going back to what I said earlier, I really think perseverance is key. Even if you have one bad experience or a couple of bad experiences, I think there's amazing value that can be derived from just keeping at it and trying to learn from your mistakes. So it's working through the problems that you have. It's understanding what they might be coming from. The other thing is really exercising your creativity. So a lot of people get started with kits, and I think that the kit marketplace has grown. I think it's great. I really do. The differentiation available in terms of style and clones, your own thing. I think it really opens the door for people to take beers in their own directions. So I think it's inspiring people on its face, in that there are so many options available. So I think that having this progression from trying different kits, trying different styles, maybe then moving to all grain, I think that tapping into your creativity is important, and persevering through any problems is also a key ingredient.
And that's actually a question I wanted to ask you too, in regards to extract versus all grain. Do you feel like there's a time that someone should, like training wheels? At least when I think of extract brewing, that would be the beginning phase. Is there a specific time that you would recommend taking the training wheels off and going to all grain? Or because I'd have to assume some people just dive right in and go all grain. It's almost like the comparison I think of is whether you get out a box of spaghetti or you make fresh pasta in a little roller with flour and dough and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a function of a couple of things, but I think it's a function of somebody's knowledge of the brew process to begin with. So with my experience, with craft beer not being where it is today, and back in 2009, the brew process wasn't something that, I'm going to go down to my neighborhood brewery and learn about brewing. It wasn't as accessible. It was still accessible, don't get me wrong, plenty of message boards. But for me, I was learning by doing. So I think if your aspiring home brewer is learning by doing on their own, then the training wheels help so much. And moving to all grain for me was a handful of kits. It wasn't too many. It wasn't a lot. And still, there's nothing wrong with kits if you want to continue down that pathway. What I will say is when you make the jump to all grain, your background can help a lot, whether that be chemistry bent. And the other thing that helps immensely is having a mentor of sorts, whether that's somebody from your local brewery, from someone that's just in your homebrew club, or somebody online, whatever. I think that can really go a long way and help clarifying some of the more ambiguous points or more unclear points about the all grain brewing process.
Are you looking for a better way to attack your social media efforts? Do you need help developing a plan that will help you maximize your initiatives? Do you feel like you're doing nothing but wasting time on sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then it's time for a jumpstart. Check out the Breaking Brews social media jumpstart and discover an easy way for us to join forces and take your business to new levels. From a complete analysis of your current presence to an intensive strategy session designed to develop and execute your plan of attack, the social media jumpstart is a great way to build a foundation that will lead to long-term results. To learn more, visit www.breakingbrews.com/jumpstart today.
Well, let's talk now about making that transition from home brewing to professional. And the first question I'm going to ask you, Zach, I don't even really know if there's an answer to this. It may end up just being rhetorical in nature, but let's just equate it to your personal experience. When did you know it was time to make that jump? And as you were home brewing and saying, I really think I could take this to a new level. Is there a time frame on that, and how did this all come to you and let you know that it was time to make that move?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that the answers to that question are certainly varying from person to person, without a doubt. And for me, because I started Nobelstein with a handful of other guys, and at the time our roles were different, or slightly different than they are now. It's really a function of so many factors whenever you consider that. So for us, when we opened the company, when we decided to pursue it as a commercial entity, much of the encouragement was, of course, from our friends and family that were enjoying the beer. They encouraged us from the get-go and said, hey, you guys should keep pursuing this, especially if you're passionate about it, and see where it takes you. And I can remember a number of people that I view as mentors in my life trying our beer as early home brewers and telling me outright, maybe this will turn into a business for you someday. And so it's really cool and kind of cathartic in a sense to have that in the back of my mind. Yeah. So I would say that there wasn't necessarily one day for me. And of course, whenever a couple of my partners departed our business, and when I took the brewing on myself, that was an experience also that was notably different. It was really, I felt, a great opportunity for me to continue to be creative on the brew side directly, as opposed to indirectly, as I had been since we'd opened before that.
When you guys first opened, were you all involved with the brewing process? How did that work?
I would say to a certain extent we were involved with at least recipe design and beer selection, but no, we weren't all there on brew days per se.
Okay.
Not every time.
Let's fast forward to where you are now, or you're taking over, and you are now the head brewer. What was the hardest adjustment that you had to make when you took the reins and started brewing on just you as the head guy?
It's funny because the brew steps and everything surrounding the similarity in process to homebrew, there was some sensibility to that to structure my day around, so to speak. Really the hard parts for me, I'm not a very mechanically inclined person, so a lot of it was simply adjusting to using all of the bits and parts and pieces of the brew house and of each of our vessels and whatnot. So getting used to that it wasn't intellectually taxing necessarily, but it was something that personally was just out of my typical comfort zone, because prior to that I worked in finance, so I was sitting at a desk. I wasn't working with my hands at all.
Yeah, that's a big transition, or
For
big
sure.
change, yeah.
But no, in general, I think that understanding what I needed to look for in the brew process itself, we were fortunate in not having a huge brew system, 3.5 barrel that we double batch. So that helped the transition for sure.
Well, when you did that first brew, did you experience any types of similarities to your homebrewing experience?
Definitely. Although the equipment was different, each phase is, of course, comparable or the same. So, like I was saying before in the prior answer, these were kind of like the landmarks during the day. So I'm looking at, okay, well, here's our mash, here's our sack rest, whatever. Okay, I'm watching the boil. Everything's virtually the same there, other than the volume of liquid. There were a couple of additional parts and a couple of differences in, for instance, the whirlpool mechanism and the cooling and the knockout through our heat exchanger. So those things were, in essence, a lot easier from a function perspective, but from a setup perspective, that's where it took me a little bit of time to get used to fumbling around with the tri-clamps and whatnot. So especially whenever there's plenty of sticky wort around, it messes with my ability even more.
Having brewed with you, yes, I can attest.
That was, I deserved it.
So are there any skills or techniques that you pick up during homebrewing that are no longer relevant once you start brewing on the professional level?
That's a loaded question. And to be honest with you, my answer to that is no. I think that every single skill that you can pick up while you're homebrewing, your setup might be different, but understanding what's happening, understanding the chemical changes that are occurring, understanding why you're in certain temperature ranges, understanding really all of the steps and why they're required. I think it's all vital. There might be some little tricks and whatnot that you do use on the homebrew side that you don't end up using professionally, but I really encourage people to be sponges with these processes.
What would you say were some of the bigger difficulties that you faced when you started brewing on a bigger system than your homebrew setup?
Well, the big thing was adjusting to the manual efforts that I had to make, the tri-clamps and whatnot. It sounds so stupid, but it was just a weird transition for me there, and thankfully I think I've at least become reasonably good. I wouldn't say great, but that being said, most of the other steps to that transition, I was really thankful to have Max train me well and ensure that I knew how our system functioned and everything. So all in all, there weren't a lot of things that stuck out as particularly painstaking. The one thing that occasionally happens with the milling process, or with the mash in process, really, is you have to come up with manual interventions if you run into clogs or things like that. So I've become adept at using a turkey baster to free up grain if it does clog in our grist hydrator. It's stupid little things like that, finding quick fixes to problems that are going to set you back 15, 20 minutes.
Like MacGyver shit right there.
Exactly. I feel a little bit more like MacGruber, but I'll take MacGyver.
As long as nothing has exploded in the house yet, then you're good to go. Any of the recipes that you guys created when you were homebrewing, did they translate well to the bigger system, or were there a lot of tweaks? And I mean, obviously you're scaling up, but were there any major monumental changes you had to make to any of those beers to make them come out the way you wanted?
You know, we were pretty fortunate from that perspective. We did, as you said, we had to adjust some hops. We did have to make adjustments on a lot of the recipes, but nothing outlandish, nothing that totally changed the character of a certain beer or really changed the core of it. So it's funny that you mentioned that too. We have Brazen Wit, and that's something that we try to keep around pretty often. It's popular beer for us. That's actually, I think it was our second oldest homebrew recipe. So that was something that I thought was really neat, how that translated so well on the commercial side. Now, you know, in the grand scheme of things, we're fortunate to say that I think we came up with some good homebrew recipes that we carried through and continue to utilize. So,
what should any homebrewer know before making the decision to become a professional brewer?
Well, the one big thing that this, and I should reflect back a little bit and shed a little bit of light on this first, but the change in cleaning is really an interesting thing to consider when you're making that jump. So although it's not the brew process per se, it's obviously something you're doing all the time, whether it's post-brew, maintenance, cleaning, whatever. The cleaning processes that are implemented are super, super extensive. So, you know, you feel like you're a janitor 75% of the time. That's the analogy that I've heard, at least. That is something it's required. There's no way around it. So for the home brewer aspiring, you might be used to cleaning your carboys. You might be used to cleaning your fermenters just with a scrub brush or a hose or whatnot. You know, those skills that you've built and the patience that you've built doing that is really foreshadowing in terms of the skills and patience and attention to detail that you need to have on the commercial side. So I would definitely say be prepared for extensive amounts of cleaning and be prepared to dedicate yourself to ensuring things are extremely thoroughly dealt with. Again, we were fortunate to have a good group of home brewers together that were thorough with cleaning and did research rather than just arbitrarily sprayed things out.
And hope for the best.
Exactly. So that scale up and that process shift has been one that's, it's something that I've talked to home brewers that have made the jump, and they're like, it's so much cleaning. Yeah, it's absolutely so much cleaning.
Yeah, I've heard 90%. Some, I guess that's all arbitrary anyway. But I guess if you're really doing the math,
yeah.
It's some scary stuff. But I think anybody listening to this podcast can, whether you're already homebrewing or you're thinking about taking that first step, there's a lot of great ways that you can get into that world, whether it be joining a homebrew club. There's some great books out there. The American Homebrewing Association website has a lot of great resources that can help turn you on to things. And I think anybody that wants to go to that professional level, you can learn a lot by picking up some knowledge at the homebrew level, but check out a brewery and see if they need any help.
Yep.
If you've got a brewery that you like to frequent, I know a lot of them are looking for house, and whether it's helping grain out or clean kegs or whatever the work may be, it gives you that opportunity to learn the business from the ground up and get a good feel for whether you feel it's right for you.
Sure. And you're absolutely right in mentioning a lot of the local organizations that they're in support of this, like the homebrew clubs and things like MBAA and other consortiums of brewers. I know there's the Pittsburgh Brewers Guild. You know, these types of organizations, it's really amazingly encouraging to see how positive and how willing to help they are with their fellow brewers and homebrewers alike. You know, I think that's something where I've been so encouraged to see events like the Homebrew and Chill that was part of Greensburg Craft Beer Week this past year. You know, there were, gosh, I don't even remember the number, but there were probably 20 or 30 different homebrew groups there, all of whom were hanging out and drinking good beers together, and had the privilege to be a part of that event and just see the quality of beer that's being produced by these groups. And I think it's great. I think it makes everybody better. So having dialogue with your local brewery, having dialogue with your fellow homebrewers, you know, I think it all is pushing people in the right direction and building the appropriate set of expectations that you need.
I would say 9 out of 10 brewers that you talk to started on the homebrew level. So it's there for everybody, but you have to be willing to put in the time to learn. And I think Zach's story is pretty inspiring in the fact that it's got, you know, there's a lot that you can learn. There's a lot that he learned, and then he took the step, and things are going great at Noble Stein, and you keep learning every day, right? I mean, this is
absolutely
clearly something that's not going to ever just stop. You're always going to be evolving your knowledge and your skill set.
Absolutely. And it was really in retrospect, it was fortunate to be in the place in life that I was when I was, and being able to ride the wave, so to speak, of craft beer as it's expanded really here in Western PA over the past nine-ish years. You know, I think it's something that I'm incredibly thankful for, to even have the opportunity to be a part of it.
Well, Zach, thanks for taking a few minutes to share your story. And for all of you aspiring homebrewers or soon-to-be professional brewers, hope you took away some good knowledge from his story. And we will catch you guys back on the Breaking Brews podcast on the next episode.
Rock on.
Thanks, Zach.
You got it.
All right, kids, that is session 21 of the Breaking Brews podcast. I'd like to once again thank Mr. Zach Morrow of Noble Stein Brewing Company for joining us on the show. You can check out the show notes for links to connect to Noble Stein to see everything they've got going on at their brewery in Indiana, Pennsylvania. And I hope you homebrewers out there got some inspiration from Zach and are ready to take that leap into the professional brewing world. And for all of you boys and girls out there that have been thinking about getting into home brewing to see if it's for you, hopefully you picked up some tips from Zach that will spark that interest even further, and you start making some kick-ass home brew for us to enjoy. Moving on, next week, we got 7 days between now and then, but we're jumping into session 22 of the Breaking Brews podcast, and session 22 is going to be all about malt. I was fortunate enough to get a tour of CNC Malt Company in Fenelton, Pennsylvania, which is just about 20 minutes outside of Butler, PA, and Mr. Brendan Carroll gave me a tour and dropped some great information about malting. I'm hoping to turn this into a series here on the Breaking Brews podcast where we talk about the different ingredients that go into the liquid that we love. This episode, of course, upcoming is covering malt. We're going to be talking about hops at some point. We'll be talking about water, and we'll be talking about yeast. So I'm looking for some experts that can come on the show and tackle those subjects with me. That's a bit outside of my wheelhouse, so I'm looking to tap into the expertise of the folks that do that for a living. Brendan at CNC Malt has been doing a fantastic job. These guys purchased an old elementary school that they have repurposed into a malt house. And Brendan's going to give you the lowdown about the importance of malting and how it really is the soul of beer. So lots of great information coming up on session 22. Hoping you guys will join in, check out what Brendan has to say. But we're going to have a great time covering the process of malting, and you're going to learn why it is such an important factor in the liquid that you love. That is session 22 of the Breaking Brews podcast coming at you next week. Before then, jump back in the archives. Sessions 1 through 20 are waiting for you to listen to. You can also subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. Drop a rating, drop a review, tell a friend. check out the new Facebook group, Breaking Brews Podcast Central. You can connect to it on the Breaking Brews Facebook page. Also look up Breaking Brews Podcast Central. Ask to join the group if you're not already a part of the fun, and I will make sure that you are a part of it. We'll be sharing exclusive interviews on that page. We'll be doing some cool videos. Some content that is not shared on the podcast will be dropped in the group. It's going to be a good time. Looking to make that group very active, and I would love for you to be a part of it. So jump over to Facebook, join that group. Also, just got Instagram TV going on Breaking Brews Co. on Instagram. So looking to drop some quick beer reviews on there. Looking to connect with you guys via video format on Instagram as well. Doing everything we can to push the Breaking Brews podcast to the roof, to the moon, as far as it possibly can go. You can help do the same by sharing with your friends. Rating and reviewing the show will help this podcast find the ears of more thirsty beer professionals and thirsty beer enthusiasts. I thank you in advance for doing your part. Thank you very much for listening to Session 21 of the Breaking Brews podcast. My name is Jason Sircone. We'll be back next week with Session 22. Until then, this has been the Word of the Poured.